All right, everybody. First of all, you still hear me okay? I just made a change here to my microphone. Hi,
I
everybody.
do.
Welcome back one more time. Living Stronger Longer, living your best life after 40. Today, I am very happy to be sitting down with Luke Hammond. Luke is in Milwaukee, I believe, today. Am I correct?
That's
And
right.
Luke grew up in the United Kingdom, as you'll probably notice once you hear him speak. He'll have the British accent. And also, Luke and I spoke earlier this year, and I think various social media through the community that we both sort of belong to because of common interests. I think we've seen each other on social media for a number of years. And Luke has a neat background. He has a background in recruiting in terms of headhunting and finding people in the medical community, and also has worked as a chiropractic technician, and also is sort of an entrepreneur. What I'm hearing, maybe serial entrepreneur might be somewhat fitting and whatnot. He's looking at different things. He has done one-on-one exercise instruction. He has a studio, of course, which you'll see in the background. But that's not his main focus at this point in time. But what I really liked when I first spoke with Luke is it became really apparent to me that he's a critical thinker and that he evaluates things from a very rational perspective. So I thought it would be very interesting to hear his ideas today, and we'll chat more about various details about some of his interests and points of view and how he arrived at it. So first of all, before we started recording, I asked Luke about his interest in exercise because based on his LinkedIn profile, it seems to be recent from the point of view of a commercial endeavor, but he told me about where his interest first started was quite young, really as a young boy. Can you fill in any blanks I may have missed or correct me on the bio, or maybe tell us a little bit about your background, not just in exercise, but background in general?
Sure. Yeah. So my interest in exercise started when I was 10 or 11. My family had moved to a different part of England at the time, and I was, in the process of making new friends. There was a boy at our school, probably early onset puberty, so he was quite a lot bigger than everyone else. And I remember people making comments about him, having abs or big arms. And it was kind of at that moment, and I'd always been a child, like, if I'd known that I could go out and find the information to do something I wanted, I would just do it. And so it was the first time I'd ever even thought, you can actually work to get big muscles. Like I'd never thought about it before, but I went home and I asked my dad if I could learn how to exercise. So that Christmas, he bought me some dumbbells. And honestly, since first picking up those dumbbells, I later got a pull-up bar and, a couple of other bits of equipment and basic stuff you can do at home. I had not missed, I probably missed maybe a month of exercise in the last 21 years. I did it every single day when I was a kid, push-ups, pull-ups. I was always active. I was engaged in various martial arts. I boxed on an amateur level in the UK for a few years before moving here. And at the same time was interested in bodybuilding and, just the normal, you know, upper lower split 4 or 5 days a week plus boxing, very, very high volume, very intense, very, a lot of ballistic movements, things like that. I moved to America in 2012 to pursue a degree. It's called a Master of Divinity degree. It's like to become a church pastor. So it's like a regular master's degree, but it's 3 times longer. And I ultimately never ended up finishing that because it was, my life changed. A couple of different things happened that I ended up moving and just couldn't keep up with that. But that whole time, since I moved to America, I got into gymnastic strength training. I don't know if you've ever heard of what that is, but it's, mostly rings and a lot of like straight like body levers and short high intensity holds, things like that. Volume's still pretty high. And at the same time I'd become interested in powerlifting. I read a lot of like Charles Poliquin's work and Louis Simmons and joined a powerlifting gym and started hanging out with those guys and learning all those things, and honestly had never really gained any kind of deep understanding of anatomy or how muscles worked until I started working for a chiropractor while I was still in college. And his name was Casey Horvath. He still practices. He's like probably 45 minutes south from where we are now. And he had a normal chiropractic studio, but it was like an evidence-based chiropractic clinic. He offered like a monthly membership where people would come in, they would get their adjustments, and they would also get access to his kind of exercise program, which was, now I look back on it, like brief, high intensity training. The main machine that he used was something called a Biodensity Machine. And I since leaving there, I'd read the research, as like they compiled all the research they'd done to create this piece of equipment. It's called Osteogenic Loading. It's a book. You can go out on Amazon and buy it. But it was basically a machine designed to stimulate bone density development. So that's hence osteogenic loading. When in their book, they'd also made some allusions to Arthur Jones, but I'd missed that completely like 8 or 9 years ago, and said that it was just as good at building muscle as regular weight training. I used the machine for myself, but in my mind, it was this very brief, very intense, very high effort stimulus purely for bone density improvement. So I saw a lot of elderly sort of patients who had osteoporosis come in, and they were off the calcium, and they were just doing this and some vibration therapy that he did. And I saw over the few years that I was with him, people's T scores going like not only reversing but going up into the positive. And piece of equipment, $60,000. It's very easy to set, very easy to use. But I found that very interesting. And then ultimately I left. I was considering going to chiropractic school, actually, because he kind of won me over. Like, it was very, very straightforward, very practical. He gave me all of his books, which when I was on my breaks, I sat and read them, and I read them at home. And then ultimately kind of left to move to Milwaukee. I met my now wife and, made that move. And so my interest in high intensity training after that, before that, I had been training 6 days a week, maybe 7 sometimes, 2 sessions a day. It was powerlifting and lots of pull-ups, like I was training for the one-arm chin-up and handstands and capoeira, and extremely high volume, a lot of rock climbing and bouldering, and basically anything. I was just interested in anything, and I love learning about things, as you can maybe tell. I always want to read the book. I always want to talk to the people. I always want to go and visit the gym. It's something I've just always liked. And at this point, I was probably 26. So I'm 31 now, so it's 5 years ago. I tore my bicep for the second time when I just fell over and caught my arm behind me, and it tore my proximal bicep tendon, the lateral one. Prior to that, I'd torn it once before. I'd also torn my hamstring and my hip flexor, and it was just par for the course, right? You do these activities, and the volume was so high. I was just, I was beaten down every day, and I was starting to, get pretty sick, pretty injured, and just generally sore. It was around that time that I developed like an autoimmune condition, right when I was training with a movement coach called Ido Portal. I don't know if he's like a name that's really in our community at all, but a lot of the kind of movement culture started with this man about 15 years ago. So I trained with him for a very brief period of time, and the volume was enormous. It was 4 to 5 hours of training a day, balancing, handstands, strength work, rolling on the ground, boxing, all kinds of stuff. And I actually, an autoimmune condition that was probably dormant for most of my life, because many members of my family actually have one as well. It came on full force. I was just so overtrained, so over fatigued, so inflamed that I had to stop the training. My face swelled up. My joints were making audible creaking sounds, when I was moving. And so I stopped the training. I took a little rest, met with a couple of other coaches that were in, my community at the time, and went right back to training high volume, for a few months, then tore my bicep again. And I was just like, this cannot carry. Like, I'm not going to be able to do anything in a couple of years because I just keep messing myself up. So my wife and I went on vacation to Mexico, and I don't know how I got a copy of Body by Science. And this is basically everyone's story, right? They get a copy of Body by Science, or someone recommends it to them. They read it. I don't know what their reaction is, but I was like, there's absolutely no way this works. Absolutely no chance in a million years. Like, I've spent my entire life just hitting everything as hard as possible all the time. And it's not like I was weak. I was just in a lot of pain and very, very chronically injured. So I read that and really just had a bit of a moment where I thought, I'm not going to be able to maintain this pace for the rest of my life. I have to accept that I'm probably wrong about some of this stuff, like that maybe some of the things I've been pursuing are not worth it. I also just kind of had to say it's either me attempting to do this low volume style of training or basically give up. Because one more bicep tear, and it's just, you have to basically start from the beginning, no pulling for 4 or 5 months. and it's just depressing, honestly. It's the second time it happened. I think I threw up because I was so upset, like I was lying there on the ground and, here we go again. Right. So while I was on vacation, the hotel, the resort that we were at had a gym, and I kind of wrote out a version of Body by Science's workout with the exercises I did, so like one arm chin up and handstand push-ups and back squat and, push-ups and rows, things like that. Tried it out, came home, went to a 3-day split. And at that point, I was so, I would say, addicted to training like as frequently as I was, that every morning that I would have trained otherwise, I read an Arthur Jones book and went on a walk at the same time, just to kind of like keep myself going. And amazingly enough, my injuries, all the chronic inflammation and fatigue, and I just was dreading doing anything most of the time. My work was suffering as well. My job's very stressful, so you have to be pretty sharp and be available all the time, and that was kind of starting to just be more difficult for me. And those things just started to clear up slowly. And I had a good understanding of how strong I was because I'd trained for so long doing so many different things. And some of the exercises that I'd struggled to achieve, with calisthenics or gymnastic strength, like you have these benchmarks that are movements that you do. So a one arm chin up is a 1 rep max, and either you can do it or you can't. It's not like as graded as a progressive strength training piece of equipment. I know obviously you can see in the background, I've got it all now, right? And so that kind of started working. I started getting stronger. I started being able to do more reps with less work, per week. And so then was like, okay, this Arthur Jones guy, he was onto something. So I looked around my local area on Facebook Marketplace, or I think it was eBay, and found some Nautilus machines in Michigan. And so I kind of convinced my wife that we could fit these in our basement. We lived in an apartment at the time, so we had this shared basement space. So me and her and one of our friends drove to Michigan in a truck and picked up these 3 first generation. It was like a bicep, tricep, and lateral raise. You've seen them, chain driven, all that stuff. So I got them, didn't have any idea how to put them back together, brought them home, spent 2 days like being confused over photos from Bill Casto's website about how these things went back together, and just yelling at the thing. And I eventually got them together and I started using them. And beyond how good I was already feeling, the specificity of these machines, you've seen a first generation bicep curl your arms up like this, and they've got the infometric kind of the ability to do one limb at a time. And for the first time since I first tore my bicep 4 years before, so I'd had 2 surgeries since then, the pain in that area slowly just started going away, just because of the specific movement. Trained once a week for 1 set of 8 to 12, classic Nautilus protocol. And I just thought that was the most amazing thing ever, right? Like I had an injury, I'd identified a movement, that was weak or difficult for me to do. And I'd purchased a piece of equipment that specifically trained that movement in isolation. I'd never really done isolation before. I'd never used a leg extension or a hamstring curl or anything the entire time I'd ever done exercise. So I just went nuts. I was buying every piece of equipment I could. When we moved to our house that we're in now, which is where this studio is, I basically bought every single first and second generation Nautilus piece, used it, cleaned it, tried it out with a few of my friends, then kind of traded them out for different ones. And slowly over the next few years, worked my way up to owning all the Med-X pieces. I had a severance from my old job that paid me enough money to basically buy this line of Med-X equipment secondhand. And while I was waiting for my non-compete to run out from the old company, I was like, all right, I'm going to open a studio now, and where I'm obviously skipping over all the machines and all the things I tried and all the protocols and going through super slow and using a metronome or not, all those things. But that leaving that previous job and having to wait it out was really the catalyst for me getting more involved in actually training the public. So over so it's really only been 18 months that Untamed strength was a thing. And I was the busiest, probably doing 20 to 30 sessions a week, just for last year, for 8 months of last year before I started back in doing what I was doing before. So right now the gym is really just me, my wife, friends and family, a couple of people that still come. I still train some people kind of remotely, but I'm busy with my work now. And I'm pretty happy with just being involved on like an ideas basis. And the gym, I sold some pieces. I bought some equipment from, David, which is a Finnish company, I believe, and really great, pretty similar to MedX with some tweaks, not better or worse, just interesting. And so now, I'm still buying stuff and trying it out and then selling it. That's kind of always been an interest of mine. But the next phase for me is really to be more involved in either owning a larger facility or gym and kind of being part of the thinking behind how they train their clients, and also wellness clinics and things like that, where we can put something like an ARX machine in there and have it as part of their service. Like both of those things are very interesting to me. And that's kind of it.
So it's interesting background, and I see some similarities. I started working out back in '81, and I don't know that I did. At one point, I know that I would go to the gym 3-4 times a week, and I would jog there and jog back. And then often before or after, the gym where I used to go was next to an Olympic swimming pool. So I would sometimes go swim laps in between and then go do the gym. Then I was also playing hockey regularly. And so, of course, I think we both fell under the assumption that many people do, which is more is better. And then I was going to eventually become Superman. And I guess I got lucky that I ran into, like yourself, I ran into the Nautilus bodybuilding book, Ellington Darden, because this was long before Body by Science was ever published. And it just sort of made sense to me, because like yourself, I'm one of these people that when I get into something, I dive in and I read and I do these various things. Interestingly, you used the word at one point, addicted. And it sounds like we have similar personalities. When we get into something, we really get into something.
Oh yeah.
And we, take a deep dive into it. And one thing I find interesting, not just in your story and whatnot, is that not only is there the more is better sort of assumption that I think people fall prey to, but also the extent to which people accept injuries as sort of part and parcel with doing exercise. And I think that's the confusion between sports and exercise, because of course, if you're playing a given sport, I mean, that if you're playing football or rugby or hockey or whatever, that there's going to be injuries involved, and you work through them, and part and parcel. But with exercise, we think of that, but that really shouldn't be part of it. You probably look back now and say, some of the things that were happening to you should have, seemed more obvious that there was a flaw. It shouldn't have taken 2 biceps ruptures type of thing. So you sometimes reflect back about, but once you're invested in something, it's very difficult to change directions sometimes.
And I struggle with that all the time. Like I'm always experimenting with diets, or like recently I've been trying some intervals on an air bike that I just bought, just out of curiosity to see if it does anything. I'm always doing stuff like that. And for me, it's not sticking with something, it's stopping. Like I cannot stop. Like if I'm interested in something, I'm like, okay, I put it in this slot. It happens that time every single week, no matter what. Like both times I tore my bicep, the same day after of having my surgery, I was back in the gym, just not using my arm because I
Right.
can't help it. I just can't. It's just like, oh, I've made this commitment years ago, and that is good in many cases, but not good when you're trying to evaluate if something's worth your time. And that's a very hard thing. People who are interested in stuff are very narrow-minded. That's why we get so evangelical about our views. That's why that's why people will just die on a hill for the 10-10 cadence or the 4-4, because it's very difficult to have like an open hold of these kinds of things and say, because right now I don't say anything's better. I just say it's different, right? Like, high volume training doesn't not work as much as it sounds like some people say that. It definitely works because that's how the majority of professional bodybuilders train, to varying degrees. It's just different, right? And nothing that's different has exactly the same result as something else. Like, if I know I can get to downtown Milwaukee 2 routes and both routes take 20 minutes, that's not the same thing. One of them, I see the countryside, and the other one, I see a bunch of suburbs on the way past. Like, the route there has an effect that maybe is not what I'm looking for, but it's different. And so for me, and this is like in the last 2 years, I was like diehard high intensity training, worrying about overtraining, worried about all these different things, refusing to do deadlifts, all the classics, only on the machines. The strength curves weren't right. The drop-offs weren't right. I was trying to adjust that. I was trying to make cams. And in the end, I kind of had to come back and say, there are many, many ways in which somebody can get strong. There are many, many ways in which you can train. Some people are just going to be different. Like, a really valid point is, what if I just don't like training that way?
Right.
And then there's not a choice between either you train that way or nothing. You're going to be weak. Like, you're going to be weak and just like staggering around for the rest of your life, unable to do anything. Like, you can do whatever you want as long as it's safe, in my opinion. But that's seen through the lens of, I've injured myself so much, no chance. Like, I'm never going to do anything that I think is going to tear another bicep, because I don't want to have to deal with that again. But I also can't say the way that this person is training is wrong. I just think it's different. And when you go to a bodybuilding gym, when you go to a CrossFit gym, when you go to a powerlifting gym, they have something that brings people back that has nothing to do with the training methodologies. It's people hanging out, listening to music, drinking huge protein shakes, wearing the clothes, doing the supplements, looking at each other, posing. It's a cultural thing. And I think the big weakness I see with high intensity training is that the culture does not have any of the accoutrements that those kinds of things have. Like, we are very like rational, objective, or we try to be, and it doesn't have any flat, like flim flam. It doesn't have any fun stuff. It's just, you get in, it's very cold, there's a fan blowing on your face, and I don't want you talking, I don't want you grunting, I don't want you making any noise. In fact, you have to keep your face completely slack, and then you get out of here, and I don't want you to think about training again until I tell you to. And that's no fun, honestly. Like, it works for sure, but there's a huge, the world is just gray, everything's gray. And so there's a variety of ways even to do good high intensity training. And I think that's what I've learned from all this is, I just don't know everything I think I know at the end of the day. And I seem to know less and less as the years go on. It's kind of funny, honestly.
Well, you covered a fair amount of ground there, and initially you talked about an analogy as there's 2 different ways to get to middle of Milwaukee. They both get you there. You use the example, they both take 20 minutes, but then also Doug McGuff has said, we could also take another more scenic route that takes 60 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll still get there, but maybe a little more wear and tear on the car. Going back to,
Mm-hmm.
you also alluded to the safety part of it. And you said at one point, whatever works, as long as it's safe. And I know Bryce Lee, I don't know if you know Bryce Lee, he has,
Mm-hmm.
and he once, I'm paraphrasing him, so I'm careful, and if there are any errors, Bryce, if you're listening to this, the errors are mine. But Lawrence Neal was asking him about how he convinces people, something to the effect, again, I'm paraphrasing for Lawrence here, about that our rational training is superior and gets better results. And his answer I always thought was really good. He says, I don't make the claim that it will get you better results. He says, I make the claim that it's going to be more efficient and safer.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, because if you claim better results, then the onus on you is to, actually prove that. Whereas it's easier to back up the idea that it's more efficient and safer. The other thing you talked about is, what's lacking, and I agree, culture, fun, different things. But one of the things that I've been pondering about lately, and I'm thinking of doing a sort of either an article or a single podcast where I just talk, and that is, the whole thing about demonstrating strength versus building strength. But I think that when people, and I think a lot of exercise programs, when they talk about progress, they're referring to the ability to demonstrate strength better and better and better, because they're counting how many burpees can you do, or how many hip push-ups or hip chin-ups or whatever it is you can do. But I think sometimes what we miss, other than the fun thing, is that progress that's very tangible in a numerical way is very addictive and very motivating to people. And if you can sort of provide that, I'm still sort of playing with how to do that in a HIIT format, I think is really important. The other thing too is placebo. A lot of exercise research, because I think that people who go to a gym where there's a lot of big guys and become convinced that they can be big too because all these other guys are getting big, I think there's actually a placebo effect at work there. I think CrossFit has that. I think a lot of things have that. And even, we sort of often, when I say we, our community will talk about how functional training is based on improper concepts around skill conditioning and things like that, or skill acquisition. And I agree with that, but I think we discount confidence, which is if I tell you that balancing on a Bosu ball is going to improve your balance, and you believe me, and you get better at the Bosu ball, and then you go do some other activity that requires balance with greater confidence. I think that greater confidence alone, because if you know a little bit about balance, if you're doing something that requires balance and you're nervous about it and you're tentative, it's almost like if you're afraid to fall, you're more likely to fall.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Whereas if you relax and sort of go with the flow. So I do think that even though it doesn't, I do believe that one skill doing something doesn't transfer to another skill, but I think you can't underestimate how much, call that placebo or confidence, how much that falls into play. And that's why I think a lot of people argue it works. Sure, it works. Look, and they're gonna, and they can give concrete examples of why. But again, I think safety, where I land with a lot of this, is whatever you're doing, as long as you stick with it over time, which implies that you didn't hurt yourself, and implies that it wasn't so time consuming that, because, a lot of what you're describing in your journey took places in your 20s. Whereas once you start having 2 or 3 children and a job and some volunteer work and things like that, even if you wanted to do those things, it's simply, unless you did it for a living, you're a professional athlete, it simply wouldn't be feasible. So that's why I find sometimes HIIT or whatever it is superior in the sense that it's much more likely to be something you can maintain doing for life. Because you're less likely to injure yourself, right? And less likely to just give it up because you simply don't have time. Now, if you look at what somebody can do to get in the best shape they possibly can in the next 6 months, then there's probably a lot of options to fall into play. But if your goal is to be in the best shape that you can be when you're 75, then I think the options then become much narrower. Does any of that make sense to you?
No, it does make perfect sense to me. And I personally don't ever see myself straying beyond 25 minutes twice a week. I just don't. For the reasons that you said, I experience a lot of anxiety. You know, in addition to the pains and the injuries, I experienced a lot of anxiety because I knew if I had to go to a social event, I got to catch up on my training. You know, and it's not like I was getting weaker because I was overtraining. I think that's kind of an interesting thing. Like when I was injured, I wasn't not continuing to appear to be better at doing squats or better at doing one arm pull ups, although I was able to go past later on. It was just that like my body was not, there's just so many factors to it that are involved beyond just, are you as big as you could be? Are you as strong as you could be? You know, and so for me, I think that there's no substitute for experience, which is just another way of saying like it's like the anecdotal empirical method. Like if you want to say whether or not something works, you have to do it for long enough that you're bored of it, or it stops having the effect that you thought, or you realize it had no effect. And that's incredibly difficult, incredibly time consuming. And I think that the fitness industry struggles from anything that feels in the short term like it's difficult, or the person doing it, if they're with as you mentioned CrossFit, like they all kind of look the same. And I think that there is a bit of a placebo effect, the community, but there's also a survivorship bias,
Sure.
which is people of certain physiological structures with the right genetics, you know, their femurs are the right length and their arms are the right length, and they can do the deadlifts and the squats and the clean and jerks and all the other things and the butterfly pull-ups. Like they will just make it to competition. All
Right.
the other lanky people, like I've got incredibly long arms, really long femurs. Like if you try and see me doing a back squat, like a high bar back squat, and you look at my pelvis, it rolls before I even get to parallel because my legs are just not. I've stretched for hours, for years to try and fix that. And it goes nowhere. If someone had just said, hey, look, let's do an x-ray and look at your femurs and just measure some of these angles, no chance, mate. You're never going to be able to do an ass to grass back squat because your legs aren't right for it. And so like that's another thing. There's a lot of nuance. There's no substitute for understanding that. But on the flip side of it as well, I do realize that, say your intention is to get very, very strong in terms of a metric that's an exercise like a deadlift or a bench press or a squat, you know, the typical powerlifting ones. You can't really just do high intensity training and get the highest possible deadlift. Like Eddie Hall or any of those people that have done these crazy deadlifts, like their training requires increasingly diminishing returns to squeeze that extra 0.2% out of their deadlift, right? So I might be able to get to 95% or 90% of my genetic ability or ceiling with the training I do now. Maybe I could get another couple by doubling it, and then one by doubling it again, and I can get to my very limit. And that very limit can't be sat at for more than a little bit before you start falling apart. Like you hear about bodybuilders in the cutting phase and they're preparing for competition. They'll be taking a walk in the parking lot and they'll be so lean that the fat doesn't even exist in their heels anymore, so they can't put their feet on the ground properly. You know, that is part of being a bodybuilder, but not necessarily part of building muscle. But I'm also not completely convinced that their volume in some way or another isn't necessitated by their craft. Like I have not actually said, okay, Luke's now doing bodybuilding exclusively, and I'm going to get a coach and a nutritional advisor, and I'm going to try and get as big. And I'm, you know, maybe when I'm in my 50s, I'll be like, I'll just take all the drugs as well and just see what happens. So then I can actually say for sure that my experience now of I think I was slightly bigger when I did extremely high volume training. That's my feel. That's my gut, right? We're talking like 5 pounds, but we're not. But there's still a difference, and so I would therefore say that there's a chance there may be some added benefit to your body just being in panic mode, and it will do everything it can to stay on top of it. Your metabolism will increase, your muscle protein synthesis will increase just to deal with this survival situation you placed it under. But that's not most people, and that's not going to make you last for a long time. And underneath that volume is a massive amount of different variety of things that you can do to pretty much be the same, but without all that time spent. And I think that's just life, right? You know, like you can make a lot of money in one day or almost no money in 3 months. And you've got to do both to find that day where you make a lot of money. That's just the way that it is. You know, that's what serendipity is about. And so my more recent interest in the strength training piece of things is I've now been bringing back some exercises that I completely ditched just out of curiosity to see if there's any difference in the 2 years since I last did them. So, you know, I mentioned doing a one-arm chin-up, and I'm quite big for someone to be able to do a one-arm pull-up. I'm 185 pounds. I never achieved it. I achieved it on one arm once in 2015. I remember because I have a video of it, and then never did it again. And then came back, tried it again, never achieved it. When I started high intensity training, still couldn't get it on both arms. And the only time I ever got it was 2 years after starting high intensity training. And I came up with this once every 10 days, one arm pull up set that I did, and got it for like a period of 2 weeks where I got both arms on my first try. Incredibly difficult and incredibly taxing on your nervous system, difficult psychologically to build yourself up to and to even recover from. And then it was gone, right? And so there is something to say that you can train in a high intensity fashion if you're able to tweak it to achieve a specific goal that is not just muscular fatigue. Like I'm actually trying to learn how to pull my body weight up with just one arm, right? You know, and that's interesting to me. I find that fascinating, you know, and my elbow started hurting. That's why I stopped doing it. But I was able to do it, and it required some lateral thinking in terms of like, you're not going to be able to do a set of one arm chins. You're going to be able to do one, and then you have to do like a breakdown where you add some resistance, and then I would jump on the pull down machine, and that pulling set lasted for 2.5 minutes, and that was enough for me to get it, you know. And recently I've come back and started doing it again, and I bought a pulley system with a harness to see if I can try training it with a 4/4 cadence and not do any of the other stuff I did before. I highly doubt I'll get there because I think it's just that close to my limit, right? And as I get older, my limit is going to start dropping. It already has, right? Like it's just the way that it is. Doesn't mean I'm going to lose muscle mass. It just means that my neuromuscular ability, my ability to just absolutely put everything I got into this one movement is just going to diminish over time. That's okay. You know, I don't mind that. But I think that the fact that it is possible leaves us a lot of room for experimentation. There's a lot of exercises out there that you could learn how to do that have an increased risk for sure, an increased stress on your nervous system for sure. Like I would never say that that's not the case, but it keeps you engaged, like you said, because now you're like, hey, not only am I the same size, but I'm kind of working towards something that's going to take me 6 months to achieve. And that's cool. You know, you got the rest of your life to train. You don't want to just say, I've got this one set on the leg curl. My weight's just going to hover around that and that'd be it. You know, I think that eventually you'll just become a little bit disconsolate with that. I would anyway, you know.
Well, I think also there's an educational thing, and see, for me, most of my clients are my age or even older.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, one of the things you talked about is, you know, if you doubled, you know, you might get a little bit more, and if you're quadruple, you get a little bit more, and that much closer. And I'm sort of thinking, in a sense, I'm grateful to the people who push those extremes, whether it be in exercise or in music or in any field, because those people kind of show us what human beings are truly capable of, and they can be very inspirational. But I think that they often pay a very high price in doing that. Sometimes people have mental health issues as a result of being, you know, obsessively focused on something. And of course, the athlete often is embodied by science. And there's a point at which health and fitness track, and there's a point beyond which performance improves, but health can go the other way. And sometimes, you know, when my clients will ask me a question about, you know, why did you change this up? Why am I doing this exercise instead of that exercise? Or you changed the order and you know, something like that. And they say, why did you do that? And I will freely admit to them, I'll say, I have some reason, but what you have to understand is at the end of the day, it probably doesn't make a whole lot of difference anyways. Um, the biggest, as long as that don't hurt you, because these people, of course, they just want to avoid the long-term care facility. They want to be able to play golf as long as they possibly can. They want to be able to play with their grandkids. They want to be able to be, functionally able to do things. And I said, if you were competing in the Olympics where a fraction of a second might make the difference between a gold medal and not even placing, then these things, maybe you start to really drill down and look at what might make a difference. But if all you're looking for is to enjoy your life, with good functional ability for as long as you possibly can, I said, you don't want to lose a whole lot of sleep over the intricate details of this, because at the end of the day, and it's interesting, I read articles. I read an article by Bryce Lee yesterday, and I've read about other people who talk about frequency, whether once or twice or 3 times a week is better and things like that. And I find it interesting that even among the community that I'll refer to as rational exercise, there's quite a bit of, and I'll use the term noise. I just started reading this book for people who are listening to audio of this. It's called Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment. And it talks about, I'm just at the first couple of chapters, it talks about how, for example, judges will give widely varying sentences for the same crime, or even the same judge will give widely differing sentences depending on what day it is, how tired they are, whether they've had lunch or not, and things like that. And it talks about medical diagnosis being really varied. And it just got me to thinking about how, there's a lot of people, and you used the term a while ago, where people will, I think you said, just sort of hang their hat on 4-4 or 10-10 or whatever, and people that I respect and whatnot on some of these details really disagree with each other. And I remember my wife and I took ballroom dancing for a long time. And one of the teachers once told us the only thing 2 ballroom teachers will ever agree on is that the 3rd ballroom teacher is doing it wrong. And it just occurs to me that this book is sort of, because I've been fascinated by cognitive biases for a long time. And this is another thing about human judgment, noise. And it's just sort of, actually tomorrow morning, I'm interviewing Lawrence Neal. And
cool.
Lawrence, and I basically, one of the questions I want to ask Lawrence is, you've interviewed so many different people in the last few years and heard so many different aspects. Is it leaving you completely confused, or is it leaving you figuring out that there's some people you figured out know what they're talking about? Or I've heard him sometimes say all roads lead to Rome anyways. So it's interesting, because exercise research in general, I find, doesn't have nearly the rigor of, say, engineering or things like that. And they'll use terms like speed and power and explosiveness, and never actually, if you think about it, they'll never define those terms. Or the ideal thing to build speed is this many sets per week, without even defining what speed is or what a set is. And
sure.
So it's really left to, like you said, the empirical and anecdotal in many cases. So now,
yeah, it's very true. And what you said about noise reminds me, an author that's probably been the most influential for me, just in terms of how I think about things, is Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He was an economist. I've read every one of his books. I reread them every year. And it is exposing our biases about causality and about just the way that we think things are and how little we really know about what causes them. And so you're talking about noise, and his example, and I'd kind of done this naturally because my dad used to get really grumpy when I was a kid after he watched the news on TV at night, just because it's mostly negative. It always has been. That's the stuff that people can get behind, is the catastrophes and the terrible things that are happening in the world. But Taleb said that if you were to watch the news every single day, 99.9% of what you watch would be just noise. But if you were to watch it every month, 2% of what you saw, the stuff that actually lasted and is still being talked about after a month, is signal. And then if you took a glance at the whole year of news and you said, okay, give me a summary of the year, you would get 5% signal, 10% signal. And that's the same for the stock market. You know, I'm very, very young and understanding a lot of that stuff, but recently become a bit more involved. And so my big thing is like, you know, it takes a lot of effort to glean or to distill the actual signal from all the various factors that went into whatever reality was in this particular case. And like, I still, you know, I've been involved in exercise for a long time. I know, generally speaking, what I look like. I know how lean I am. I know all the changes I've made. Diet wise, I'm very specific with, because I'm quite sick. I have this autoimmune condition. I'm allergic to a few different things. So I know myself. But the second I extrapolate some of that information to my wife or to some of my friends, my sureness starts to sound more like, you know, speculative thinking than actual good advice. So now I'm just like, this is what I do. This is the mechanism that I think exists for why that happens, but there could be others. And the downside could be this. And if you really want to try it out, remove everything else and give it a go for 3 months and see what happens. That's the only way you'll know. And most people, the rigor involved in just doing that is too much, even for myself. Like, I give up on stuff sometimes because I'm like, I just can't even tell if this is what I'm even looking for here, right? Like, I would love to say I've got an unlimited budget. I'm going to go and buy a bunch of, you know, like Panata machines, which I've never really used. I've seen them. And I'm going to just use those and see if there's any difference. There probably isn't, I would imagine. But nobody has the time or the money or the effort required to do that kind of experiment, right? So our noise and our signal that we have, especially as it pertains to exercise, that's why people land on, it really doesn't matter if you train your abs or not, or it really doesn't matter if you train your calves or not, or I don't do any bicep curls because they don't work, because that's easier intellectually and from an effort standpoint than saying I tried training my biceps in a very specific way, the same way I train any muscle group, with multiple people for many years. I took all these measurements, I took them for DEXA scans, which are inherently pretty unreliable as well. And then this is kind of what happened when we took bicep curls out of it. No one has that. No one has that information.
That's right.
And I can say I'd not done bicep curls for huge chunks of time in my life. And as far as I'm aware, my arms didn't change size. In fact, I think my arms were a little bit bigger when I did a lot of the gymnastic straight arm lever stuff, but that resulted in a biceps rupture. So it's very likely that a bigger, you know, brachialis muscle, which is the one that sits under your biceps, was also correlated with an increased risk of tearing it. So, you know, that can be true too. Maybe you can't get the biggest biceps possible without also risking tearing one of them off the bone. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying it's a possibility.
Yeah, sure. Well, again, a lot of really good points. For people listening, Nicholas Nassim Taleb, the books that I'm aware of is Fooled by Randomness and The Black Swan and Unfragile, I think.
There's Anti-Fragile, Skin in the Game. Yes. And then he has a book of aphorisms that we leave on our coffee table. And occasionally I'll just flip it open and read a couple of those. I mean, he's a genius. And I wish he could get involved in this kind of thing, because I think that kind of critical thinking is very useful when we're trying to give people recommendations on how to think, you know. And if I could come up with a curriculum for like how to think about stuff you don't know the answers to, I would definitely get behind that. It's just a highly complex topic, and most people give up, I think, including myself.
Well, I think it's, I mean, I want to choose my words carefully here, but first of all, let me just say one of the things that you said that I wanted to echo is I find myself more and more saying something along the lines of, based on the experiences I've had and the evidence that I've seen, I think this makes sense, but I could be wrong. Right. Doug McGuff used to talk about, he wrote articles where he say things I believe but can't prove. And my version is I reserve the right to be full of shit, which is basically, but all we have, because we all are only seeing little pieces of the puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was going to say is, to me, there's a maturing thing. And Arthur Jones, God bless him, and other people in the HIIT community sort of come at it sometimes and say, this is the way it is. And if you don't agree with me, you're an idiot. And in some cases, I think some things are blatantly obvious
Sure.
to be
Yeah.
stupid. But in general, as I think I get older, I see more and more potential for nuances and realizing that, hey, because you get fixated. We're weird people. We like lifting weights. We like working hard and doing things like that. Whereas, normal people say, why the hell would you want to do that? It's hard. But if somebody came up tomorrow and said, here's this electromagnetic thing you can do, or this pill you can take that has no side effects and whatnot, or this supplement, and you won't have to work out, and you can get everything you can without working out. Well, we would probably, my initial reaction would be to fight that tooth and nail. I don't suspect something like that would happen, but it would be like, well, I've had so much invested in this that, I can't change my mind. Again, Bryce Lee quote comes to mind. I don't think it's his original quote, and I'll probably paraphrase it wrong. He says, if convincing you is going to affect your paycheck, I'm unlikely to convince you. And
yeah, that's a Taleb thing as well.
Oh, is that where that comes from? Yeah.
It wasn't a quote in that exact form, but he would have said, don't trust any advice given by someone who gains financially from their advice, which is very difficult, right? Because everybody that's spent enough time to give you any advice on a topic is probably doing it for their living. So that means really, really honest advice is hard to come by. So you have to investigate it yourself, in my opinion, for the most part.
Well, even you have a background working with in the medical community. I mean, not to open a can of worms with controversy these days, but you see a lot of medical doctors will give different diagnoses for different things, particularly in the musculoskeletal area. When you're dealing with clients who have had issues, because I have older clients, they will routinely tell me, I went to see a chiropractor and he told me this was the issue. Then I went to see an osteopath and he said, no, that's not it at all. This is what's your problem. Then I went to see a physiotherapist or an orthopedic surgeon or whatever. And all of them gave different explanations for what was the issue. And there have recently been books written on the nature of pain and how we may have looked at a mechanistic way of looking at pain when really it has much more complicated than we first thought. So I think the human body is a puzzle that's extremely complex that I think we're just scratching the surface of.
Yeah, and it's for that reason, that complexity, that I would always lean towards the minimum intervention. So if your body uses a muscle to create a movement, provided that movement's stable, it doesn't have any risk of you tripping over with a bar on your back and you're standing on an exercise ball, whatever it is, that's just common sense in my opinion, but maybe somebody would fight me on that even. But the bare minimum you can intervene while allowing the process to just carry on is better, because your body has evolved to have these processes, many of which we have no idea how they work. like hypertrophy. I've been recently reading a bit more on hypertrophy again, and it's like it happens, and I've seen it in myself, but no one can quite get to the bottom of why. Not exactly. And the people are very confident. They attract a lot of followers, and then a lot of those followers will believe that kind of training or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, it occurs because your body has determined it needs it in some way or another, and it's a response to a stimulus, and the stimulus could be anything. And I think that to go back to one of your original points, like we are very quick to assume we know why something happens based on our experience of it and not leaving any room for anything else. And as far as the interventions are concerned, like I would always say, if there's a chance that this can kill me, it's probably not worth it. Like if you're giving me the choice, like you can either be given $100,000 or you will suddenly turn to ash. Would you like to flip the coin? I would say no, because the risk far, far outweighs the reward. And so like I work in the medical field, you know, as mostly, you know, from a business standpoint, I manage a team of recruiters and help with the business development of that and negotiate these contracts. I do not go to the doctor almost ever. I don't even have a general practitioner here in this country because I just don't. I would prefer to just leave things unless it's an acute injury or traumatic injury, or I start to get the impression that I have a chronic condition that I didn't really notice until it became important. So like my wife's pregnant right now. She's 40 and a half weeks. So we are right on the edge of this baby, you know, coming into the world. And we are going no medication if we can. And, you know, we're going for a natural birth. We've been to all the classes. I've obviously read all the books and spoken with as many people as I possibly could who are in that community. But if there is a situation like mitigating circumstance or something that we don't know about, medicine exists to save her if it can. Right. The issue with the interventions is that they get used because capitalism is the driving force of this country, right? Is okay, well, I invented this drug, and this drug helps this particular process in your body, whether it's causing contractions or dulling pain. The problem is, I want to make as much money from this drug as I possibly can. So I have to like increase the number of use cases or increase the number of people that it's appropriate for to make my money. And these companies get bigger, they have more employees, they have more people on the phones and more salespeople, so they have to pay all them. So whenever they make a new drug, it has to be universally applicable. And, you know, so I think that I've struggled with the ethics of my job quite a lot because I deal with anesthesia and some of these surgeries being done maybe not being necessary. There's all that research on lumbar surgeries, you know, having no real long-term outcome that's better than they were before. But I also understand that these like trauma surgery and obstetric surgery and anything like that, they exist for the small number of cases where if they didn't, that person would die. Right. And, you know, that's how I think that's how I try to evaluate these things is if people have been doing it since the inception of our species, going out in the sun, not wearing any shoes, you know, eating stuff that we find, some of which may be poisonous, but we have mechanisms to maybe protect us from that, like vomiting. You know, you kind of form a picture of stuff that's probably pretty low risk for the most part. And if you find out it hurts you, then stop doing it. But anything beyond that is the blindly trusting that if I swallow this pill, my energy is going to be, you know, clean. That's a big thing that annoys me these days is everyone's always talking about clean energy from some supplement they take. But at the end of the day, the stuff that we have done since, you know, all throughout our evolution is probably the most reliable. And then further along, you just got to practice sort of risk management thinking to say whether or not it's even worth giving it a go. And that's kind of where I land on that. But it's obviously highly complicated and every situation is different, right? So it's like you can't just give one answer for it.
So congratulations in advance. Life as you know it is about to change.
Oh, yeah. We're aware. I've crammed more things in the last 2 weeks than I have in the last 6 months because I'm like, okay, I've got to get all this stuff done before it's too late. But I'm sure it won't be quite as bad as I think forever, but we'll see.
Well, it won't be bad. I wouldn't use the word bad. I just say, because I used to sell life insurance. And over the years, I've sold life insurance policies to parents who were about to, you know, become parents, soon to be parents. And I used to say, no matter how prepared you think you are, you're underestimating it. And then I would go back a few weeks later and deliver the insurance policy after the baby was born and say, well, was I right? I've never had anybody disagree with me. But your children, if I may, like an old guy doing a bit of a lecture thing here, your children will be your greatest source of grief and your greatest source of joy. So it's sort of both extremes. So It's going to be a new adventure for you. So it's an exciting time for you. And one of the things you talked about, with minimum intervention, I just wanted to emphasize that I thought that was a really good point, to try to do the minimum intervention needed to get the desired result. Because, there's always, you use the analogy of drugs and surgeries and things like that. And every drug, going back to from Doug's book, there's a therapeutic effect and there's a side effect, right? The ideal drug would have only therapeutic effect and no side effects. But that applies to not just drugs, but any intervention, right? One intervention, because many things, what I also thought of is an oversimplification that we have is A is good for you, B is bad for you. To me, that's an oversimplification, because some of the things that we think of as being good for us are hormesis, right? It's because when you expose yourself to a little bit of poison, then you develop a resistance to that may serve you right. I mean, that's the principle of vaccines. That's the principle of a lot of vitamins. A lot of plants that we eat actually have toxic things in them to protect themselves from us, but then we become resistant to those and can eat other plants, whatever, things like that. So, too much exercise can be toxic. And I suspect, although I may be wrong, that maybe a little bit of smoking might help your lungs to deal with air pollution.
I've thought that. I was like, if I smoked one cigarette a month, then maybe I would have that hormetic activity going on in my lungs and the rest of my body, just to flush that stuff out. I don't think it's out of the question. It's a bit irresponsible to suggest that to people, but I know I would even say that there's probably, to a certain extent, a hormetic response to overtraining, extremely high volume, right? Like, you become more able to deal with that volume the more you train, to a point. And then when it reaches critical mass, or an acute injury, or even a chronic condition that's been building under the surface, that's when you find out. But generally speaking, I think that things have to work, but I also think that things that appear to have the same effect probably may have the same effect for the thing you're looking at, but they might have a bunch of different other effects that you can't see.
Right.
And one example recently, just because it's like fresh in my mind about intervention, which I found very interesting, is I recently got into bow hunting and traditional archery. I've always wanted to, I was a big fan of Robin Hood when I was a kid. So like, I'd not really thought of it until the last couple of years. And I was like, I'm buying some bows and trying that out. Now, there's two different kinds of bows. There's like a traditional bow, which is just basically what you would see on any older movie where people are firing arrows at each other. And then there's the compound bow, which is this like highly optimized device, to make repeatable, accurate shots when you're hunting, because it's more responsible and it has greater range and all that stuff. But I actually kind of, while I was doing it, I bought a compound bow and was using it for a while. But after a while, realized that I hated it, because there were so many things to adjust, so many things that you could add, which are interventions. Like, you've got a different sight, you've got a different handle, you can raise the rest up a bit and down a bit. And so even if I can dial my shots in to be within like an accurate grouping at 20, 30, 40 yards, in doing so, I have made the whole system of archery more fragile, because the second one of those variables change, I'm on my own. Or if I drop my bow, I'm on my own. Or if somebody nudges into my sight too hard, I'm on my own again. I can't fire the bow at all. So like, I actually went in the complete opposite direction. And like, I've started chatting with someone in Hungary about some of these Mongolian horse bows. So I just bought one of those, and it's like the most bare bones thing possible. And in doing so, I'm allowing my inbuilt intuition and my brain's ability to calibrate according to how fast things go and the arc of trajectory and all that stuff. And I'm almost as accurate with this bow that has absolutely no aids on it as I was with the compound one. Now, there are obviously downsides, but what I realized was that, like, there were two things. One, the compound bow was not appealing because in any situation where it was not suited, it was useless. But a traditional bow, I could be lying on the ground, I could be kneeling down, I could be jumping up in the air, I could fire from either side, I could theoretically change hands and it wouldn't cause any problems. And in practicing something like that and learning that skill, it's also a good example of like how how diminishing returns look in practice. Like, so we're talking about muscle mass, we're talking about skill. When I first tried this other bow, completely different technique, so terribly inaccurate. But within an extremely short time, my brain calibrated to this new thing,
Right.
and my accuracy improved 400%. But then once I hit that point, in order to become an actual expert shot, shoot dimes across the yard or whatever it is, now the amount of time I need to put in to get there has gone drastically up. So there's two things, it's like the simplest thing takes a little bit longer to learn, but you can learn it fairly fast if you're consistent with it. But then to become an expert in anything requires far more time than it took to become a beginner or at least an intermediate. And all those things, those things are just running around my head all the time with stuff like that. And I think it's an interesting point that my brain has these inbuilt abilities to aim that I don't really, all I need to do is let it get used to it and I will learn how to aim a bow. Whereas if I rely too much on whether it's my supplements or the doctor telling me if I'm sick or not, or this prehab exercise or bulletproofing my knees, I think that those things are probably unnecessary purely by virtue of how specific they need to be and how little we know about whether or not that specificity has any benefit for us, right? Hopefully that wasn't too much of a tangent, but I think that thing is kind of related to the whole of what we're talking about.
Well, I'm thinking, and let me know if this makes sense, is when you have technology helping you to do something that you innately would be able to learn yourself, to some degree, it's going to help you, but it's also going to maybe lessen your use. I mean, to use like a silly example, if you, like I have I don't want to say her name here because she's going to do it, but I have one of these artificial intelligence things that in the room with me, and I'll ask her sometimes simple divisions and multiples as I'm measuring food and stuff like that. And sometimes my wife say, "Did you really ask that? You don't know what the answer to that is?" And then I realize, oh yeah, I do, because I just got so used to depending on it that all of a sudden I'm forgetting how to add and divide and stuff like that. I'm asking like stupid questions because I just got used to it, right? Or if you take a certain supplement or a certain vitamin, and then your body, which would naturally produce it, stops producing it because it doesn't need it.
Exactly.
So, does that sort of the analogy fit? Because you're using the highly technological compound bow, obviously has advantages, but it's sort of blunted your natural aiming that you have within. So
Yeah,
maybe
and in
the best of both worlds would be to have a balance of both, right?
Yeah, and I would say that it's more robust. I don't think to use a Taleb thing. It's not like using a bow as an anti-fragile thing. It's just more resistant to environmental factors that could critically damage it. Compound bow is less so. Using your AI assistant is more fragile to environmental changes. Like natural language processing in AI is the hardest nut to crack. So like when your keyboard on your phone is auto correcting you and it's like, that doesn't make any sense. It's because your brain is so much more complicated and able to understand subtle changes in how we phrase things. So the keyboard's never going to match that yet. It might, once we hit singularity or whatever, then we'll be left far behind. But I mean, another example of, trying to engineer a better version of something that already exists, which is kind of what we're talking about, is like, I don't want to open this can of worms, is like the Beyond Meat debate, right? So but they're making a analog for meat and claiming that it's just as good, if not better. And they've picked all the ingredients. You could say the same for baby formula. You could say the same for artificial proteins, but yet these already exist. They're readily available and probably taste better, although I've not tried too much of this stuff. So why would we mess with it at this stage unless there's a real downside? So they create one. They say that it's better for you, or they say that the environment is more thankful for monocrop soy and peas than it is for grazing cattle, And so that a narrative has to exist around something that's far too reliant on its formulation to avoid us having to address the fact that meat, being very close to how we're composed of ourselves, is highly, highly complex and has compounds in it that we don't even know about. There's millions upon millions of things. There will be in the peas and the soy and the chickpeas and all that stuff too. But it's a fair bet to say that why would we stop trying to invent a better version of something that's already just there?
Right.
You might be like, that might make you feel helpless. It might make you like kill the illusion that there's some optimal version of myself out there that I can get to someday. And you and I probably both agree that the second that we hear that maybe there's a new kind of exercise machine, our first thought is, I might be able to get a little bigger, or I might be able to get a little stronger. So I'll give it a go, right? You can't help it because you like it. It's human.
Yeah.
We wish and dream and tell ourselves stories. And like, I think that all in all, I always arrive back at try to just leave it. But if there's a real critical moment, like I tear my ACL or something, I have the fallback of interventional like support from the medical community, or even like if I've got a deficiency in something, I can take a supplement or I can find a food that has a lot of it in there. And even that, we don't know what else I'm deficient in. It's just, I think the general rule of thumb for me has always been, or has more recently been, find the mechanism, if you can, that your body naturally has, try to just use it. And also try not to get too far down the optimizing route where you're like, oh, just a couple more grams of protein or exactly this amount or exactly this amount of food, because it doesn't work. Like a good example recently was my wife, Deanna, before she was pregnant. She kind of got into bodybuilding prep. Like she just thought that was interesting. So bodybuilders, genetically very gifted. Many of the female competitors have a particular body type. So that's survivorship bias again. But
Right.
we spoke to a couple of coaches. We bought some books. We kind of like learned a little bit about the waterway. And you've done this before, I know, so you kind of understand. But what was fascinating to me is that as Deanna cut her calories down quite drastically, her body weight went down disproportionately. Right? She didn't lose that much weight, like because she has to do something so extreme that she actually starts losing weight very rapidly. And that's the main thing about prep, is that people get leaner and leaner as they get more into competition because they know how their body works. But it became very obvious to me that like our understanding of calories in, calories out is valid in some ways, but she was not losing weight on a one-to-one basis with number of calories that she removed per week, not even a bit, because her internal processes over time are trying to conserve muscle mass and trying to conserve energy and glucose, and you're changing the chemistry in your body by depriving it. So it's not a static target. And I thought that was very interesting, because it's like, as I've gotten older, my calorie consumption is literally half what it was 3 years ago. I haven't lost any weight, haven't lost any muscle mass. It's just the need may be changed for various reasons I'm not sure of. And now I just am a different person eating a different amount of food, and for some reason I kind of seem the same. I might find out later that I'm drastically, malnourished, but honestly, it's
I doubt
interesting.
that. I wish we had more time. There's a book called Burn. I think it's called Burn,
Mm-hmm.
and it talks about metabolism and how. I'll give you a real quick synopsis. Maybe you've already done. It's basically, this guy is an anthropologist who measures the metabolism of animals, people, and whatnot. And one of the things that he discovered, and he uses it, people drink isotope, or animals drink isotope water, and then they collect the urine and they can tell what your metabolism is. So he checked hunter-gatherer tribes who had been, they do everything. They have no technology at all, and they don't even farm. I mean, complete hunter-gatherer. So the amount of activity they do in a given day is many times the typical North American couch potato. And the surprising finding was that the metabolism was almost identical, the resting metabolism. And what they realize is that your body, if you're doing a lot of activity, it'll take away from other processes and mechanisms in your body, your immune system, your reproductive system, and things like that. Of course, Ken Hutchins recently did a thing on that where he, of course, jumped all over it, basically saying, see, I told you steady state activity was a complete waste of time. And while I agree with that, I'm not a big steady state activity fan by any stretch, but I think that the body takes time to adjust. In other words, if you do a short-term increase in activity, I think it will make a difference, but your body will very quickly adjust. And I think if you do a short-term caloric deficit, this is, I suspect, but reserve the right to be full of shit. And if you have a caloric deficit, short-term will have an effect, but your body will very quickly adjust to that. That's why, what you were saying about your wife and not losing weight commensurate to that is your body is adapting in many different ways to your either input or output of energy to compensate for it. That, which is why, because we're not calorimeters, where and we don't digest all that well and things like that. So I think that's why where I've landed is losing weight. If your goal is to lose not weight but fat, you should lose it as slowly as you possibly can. Now, of course, if you're already 150 pounds overweight and it's becoming a health issue for you, then you may not have that luxury. But like if, let's say you're going to a bodybuilding contest or just a photo shoot or something, ideally you start out your journey 6 months ahead, not 10 weeks ahead, so that you can really lose it slowly and allow yourself some cheat days to trick your body, to try to not allow it to do the adapting.
Right? Yeah, and I'd be interested to see whether, and you obviously can't take the same person's split reality and have two different ones running at the same time, but maybe your point about a short-term drastic change having a greater effect than a long-term one, like maybe to get that lean, it's necessary for it to be short-term and drastic. It's not like what I don't know for sure, but I would just say your body, because it prizes movement, it prizes metabolism, it prizes the health of the organs as best as it can. It explains why you adapt. Like if I said, hey, let's take a shot of whiskey before every single set, your performance would drop, and over time you would adapt to it, because that's just what you do, right? Because homeostasis is trying to preserve those main functions. So I really have no idea. I don't have any interest necessarily in becoming super lean, particularly at this stage. And I think Deanna as well, like she realized that she was just unhappy. And I think the drastic changes that you would have to take, and for me to become like 4% body fat or something like that, may be worth it for an interesting experiment. But that's really it. It's like an intellectual curiosity. At the end of the day, I look exactly the same as I have for the last 10 years, and I've done tons of stuff different, right? So it's like homeostasis. I'm just genetically looking this way. As long as my activity levels and the stimulus I'm putting into my system is kind of similar, then it comes full circle now, doesn't it?
And the judging criteria of bodybuilding, in my opinion, is unfortunate. That the level of emphasis on being lean is as great as it is, because that amount of leanness is far beyond what's healthy. I mean, we don't hear too much about people being under fat because, of course, people being over fat is so much more common, unless people are ill, like they're suffering from cancer or something. But there's no question in my mind, if a woman gets so lean that she stops menstruating, then your body's telling you something. And the example you gave, a man gets so, and people, bodybuilders try to do it for one day. They're trying to peak for one day. So if you can't sustain it, it's probably not healthy. Luke, I really appreciate it. I'm sorry, this probably should have a smoother finish as I get to be a professional podcaster. I'll do that, but I do have a client coming in shortly. But I really appreciate your taking the time, and I am not disappointed at all. I knew you were a critical thinker, and you would have a lot of very interesting perspectives and points of view, and you did not disappoint. And I actually hope that we can maybe do this, because I think we could have some great conversations on different topics. So I wish you the very best, especially as you're about to enter a new phase of your life endeavor. To you and your wife, all the very best, and I will look forward to talking again in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd love that. I'd love to be on again, and I'm always up for conversations like this. I tend to learn a lot, so I appreciate it.
All right. Have a wonderful day, sir.
All right. Take care.